Alex Aviña. Alex Aviña, the one and only, the friend of the show, longtime friend of the show. I mean, I'm hitting, it's a little early. Actually, it's a little early, but it's 6 days from now. I'm hitting the fifth anniversary of the show. And
Nice.
I'm very proud to count you among one of my best and recurring guests. You're also a patron, I think,
Yes.
long time now, and supporter and booster. So I thank you, Alex. These 5 years, I couldn't have done them without people like you, patrons, but also doing all this free labor for me, building this amazing content. So you're back. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks, Ina. No, it's always an honor and a privilege to be on your podcast. And yeah, I mean, things are going. Heat's finally gone away in Phoenix and Arizona, but obviously with everything that's been going on, right? Uh, shit's real right now. So, but yeah, and I love coming onto your show. It's always a lot of fun. So thank you for having me back.
No, this is, and it's always informative because you have this amazing, you're a very, I have to say this, you're very podcast friendly in your presentation. I've noticed this because I have a lot of academics on my show, and some academics are more kind of, they kind of get the podcast format and the kind of how to best kind of package it. And obviously, it's also related to like being in lectures, doing lectures. Like it's not that much of a discipline, but whenever I have your episode, I always get like a ton of responses being like, "Oh, I learned so much." So we're here to do that again. We're here, but then to pick up on an article that you wrote for also friend of the show, Louis Alday's liberated text, profiting from terror in Cold War Latin America. This was a review of Bishara Bahbah's Israel and Latin America: The Military Connection. Um, I will link it in the tag. I will link it in the episode. Um, and we should, but we wanted to kind of, one of the goal of today, we're sort of thinking of this episode as a kind of an exporting occupation, and sort of examining the very brutal, very violent legacy of Zionist military apparatus, and also more than just apparatus, but direct help in a lot of the right wing political violence across Latin America. So I will let you take it away. We should start. I was thinking the case, maybe a kind of overall view, and then we do a case study by case study approach.
Listen, I think I've posted stuff on what used to be called Twitter about Palestine and what's going on now in Gaza, and one of the responses I received is like, why do you give a shit? You work on Latin America, right? And I think when Louis asked me to write this book review, I took that as an opportunity to think through how um, for decades Israel has used Gaza and the occupied territories as a laboratory for the development of essentially counterinsurgent technologies and knowledges, and then they go abroad and they sell it and they make a profit off of it, right? So that's why it matters. It matters because every single fixed surveillance watchtower on the border between Arizona and Mexico, so about 2.5 hours south of where I am right now, is built by Elbit Systems, right? And Elbit Systems is now a target of Palestine U.S. action, that account that for some reason we weren't allowed to follow for a couple days, which was kind of weird. Some shenanigans going on there. So and if we start with like what journalist Todd Miller talks about as like the Palestine Mexico border, that allows us to work our way back in history and to look at this long relationship between Israel and some of the worst Latin American governments during the Cold War era and after, and how they collaborated with one another. And essentially, it's really the global export of occupation, counterinsurgency, and attacks against indigenous peoples. And it's developed in Gaza, developed in the occupied territories, and it's packaged and it's commodified, and it's then sold and was sold to some of the worst governments, military dictatorships, death squad governments in the history of Latin America. Some of those that we've talked about already in previous episodes. So I think that's like the broad framing is like this matters because what they develop over there against Palestinians comes back and gets us, right? We can think about police officers from throughout Latin America and also United States receiving a certain type of training in Israel, right? What do you think? Where do you think these Israeli police officers are receiving their training, their experience, right? They're being trained to be the everyday quotidian the perpetrators of settler colonialism, right? And that shit blows back on us. And it has in very real, direct, horrific ways on many different Latin American countries since at least the middle of the 1970s.
Yeah, and so I think it's the story here is one of, like, as you put it very succinctly, like, they use Gaza as a laboratory to develop this insane violence apparatus, and they make money out of it, exporting it across the world. And it's the same goes for their surveillance technologies, right? Like, it's like the things they learn spying on Palestinians, that's the tool that governments from around the world use to spy on their own people. And so it's like, Israel is a nexus is a kind of keystone site of a certain kind of neo-colonial terror that reigns all around the world in different sites and to different degrees. And so maybe we should start closest to home, the Mexican example.
Yeah. And before I jump there, like, let me say that me saying that Gaza has been used as a laboratory to then create, package, and commodify counterinsurgent settler colonial technologies, like, that's not my quote. That's like what the Elbit people will say at conferences when they go and try to sell this shit to, like, the US government, right? So like Todd Miller, who's a Tucson's a city south of here, Phoenix, he's written some really good stuff about this. So it's like, it's not that me inventing words. I'm using the very language that these private military contractors, companies, and Israeli government companies are using to sell this stuff, right? So yeah, if we begin with Mexico, well, let me just start this way. Like, after the foundation of Israel, like, most of Latin America, maybe with one or two abstentions, actually voted in favor of the establishment of the state of Israel. And at that moment in the late 40s, it was a big deal to get Latin America as a region to support it, because they were like maybe like 1/3 of all the United Nations, right, before decolonization. And you had these episodes like, you know, the folks that were sent by then radical Guatemalan president Juan Jose Arevalo, who did these trips to Israel, and they started to make these links between what these revolutionary governments in Guatemala were trying to do at home, and they saw an echo of that in the kibbutzes, right? So like, there was broad Latin American support for Israel at its foundation and throughout the 1950s.
I had no idea, actually. I had never considered that.
I think it was actually that the ambassador, it might have been for sure is the ambassador of Uruguay and maybe the ambassador of Guatemala to the UN who helped draft the resolution. So they were like, they were key players. And throughout the 1950s, I mean, the support held, right, throughout the 1950s. Even when you have the Bandung conference, you know, referencing, you know, Israel essentially as a outpost of Western colonialism in the West Asia. By and large, you know, most of Latin America continued to support the state of Israel. Even before its foundation, you had the pretty awful dictatorship in Nicaragua, the Somoza family. I mean, they were smuggling weapons into these different militias that were used against Palestinians during 1947, 1948. So like the Somoza family, which ended up being three members of a family that would rule Nicaragua from the 1930s up until 1979, like they always had maintained a close link and a close relationship. Some of that relationship started to change after the Six-Day War in 1967 and definitely throughout the 1970s. And one of the reasons why you had a changing relationship between some Latin American governments, social movements, and Israel is that throughout the 70s and 80s, like the Israeli government backed and armed and financed and trained some of the very worst governments. So we can, as I write about in that article, we can come back to those. But with regard to Mexico, the Mexico relationship starts really in the 1970s, and this is how I got into this topic to begin with. When my own research deals with like dirty war, state terror, the Mexican government committed in the 70s against guerrilla movements and social movements. And when I was doing research for my first book, I came across this reference that the Mexican Air Force and the military used Israeli-made airplanes to dump suspected guerrilla fighters and dissidents out into the Pacific Ocean, right? So these death flights, and these airplanes are called Araba airplanes. I think their military acronym is like STOL. So it's like stands for short takeoff and landing. So these are really sturdy, hardy planes that don't need much of a runway to land or to take off. They're like perfect for counterinsurgency. And some of the Mexican Air Force pilots referred to them as like an avocado or a flying avocado, because they do have kind of like that ovoid shape with these like weird wings. And that's how I started like looking into this. And then there's a whole story into how throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Israel was providing, counterinsurgent armaments like this one, not just to Mexico, but throughout Central America, especially, and then Colombia and even places like Argentina. Except that in Mexico in the late 70s, there was a lot of public pushback against the Mexican government continuing to buy Israeli armament, particularly because there was a notorious freelance independent Israeli arms trafficker by the name of David Marcos Katz, who was based in Mexico City. And very intrepid Mexican journalists started to investigate him and his dealings with the Mexican government and brought this shit out into the open. And there was a lot of pushback from civil society, from journalists, that really forced the Mexican government from the late 70s to early 80s to kind of modify its relationship to the Israeli armaments industry, which, as I mentioned in this article, is a huge component of the Israeli economy throughout the 70s and 80s. Like, it ends up, according to Bahbah's book, it's like 40% of the industrial workforce ends up working for the Israeli armament industry in the 70s and 80s. So it's a really important component. And at a moment when Israel is the most heavily indebted country in the world, like 1983, 1984. So without the armaments industry, the Israeli economy would have been in serious difficulty. Fast forward in the Mexican case to the 1990s, and in Mexico you have what some journalists referred to, I hate this terminology, but you have this indigenous rebellion that emerges in the southern state of Chiapas. And it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was after the electoral defeat of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So it was categorized as like the first postmodern revolution, right? Because it was an indigenous revolution. It was non-vanguardist, at least the way they presented themselves to the public. And what we now know is that in response to this indigenous insurrection revolution that occurred in 1994, is the Mexican military once again started to rely on Israeli armaments. But then after that, started to rely on very specific forms of training, counterinsurgent training, that they could then apply to this movement that is still around in Mexico to this day. They still control a series of autonomous provinces, and they've been suffering some pretty horrific attacks in the last couple of years by paramilitaries. And then what you mentioned, Sina, about spyware, I mean, Mexico becomes the first country in 2011, the Mexican military, to buy a Israeli spyware by the name of Pegasus.
Oh, really?
And
They're the first ones.
They're the first ones. Yeah. And there's a really shady story, right? Like, apparently, this was according to a New York Times article investigation. Apparently, they negotiate, the Mexican officials from the Mexican military and officials from, I can't remember the name of the company that produces Pegasus, the Israeli company. But they kind of they agreed to the deal in like this really seedy like nightclub, like cabaret, which is like over shots of tequila, which is like perfect, right? And then by the end of 2011, the Mexican military was able to give a demonstration to then President Felipe Calderón, this butcher who started the last drug war in Mexico in 2006. And they were able to see that they could use this spyware. The public explanation given is that this way they could track like narcos, right? They could track drug cartel activity and all that. But what we've known since 2011, 2012 is that they've used it primarily. The Mexican military has used it primarily to spy on journalists, to spy on human rights activists, to spy on feminist activists. And this is something that continued throughout the 2010s and even after the election of Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or as he's known by his acronym of AMLO. Right. So as late as this year, there's still like claims that the military is using Pegasus to spy. I mean, they even caught the spyware on the phone of AMLO's Undersecretary of Human Rights, because he's the one that was leading the investigation into the Ayotzinapa case of the 43 disappeared college students back in September of 2014. So that's like the Mexican connection. And the Pegasus one is a really, I mean, if you follow this stuff of how this works, it's really scary, right? Like this spyware infects your phone, has access to all your data, can track you, and you don't have any sort of clue that your phone has been infected by this spyware. And it's so effective, I think, that Biden put the Israeli company that produces it on some sort of like list last year, 2022, that we're not supposed to like work with them. But it's a pretty scary type of technology, and the Mexican military has used it to great effect in terms of like surveilling groups and individuals in Mexican society that they identify as subversives or as threats to political and social stability.
Yeah, I mean, this is ain't this the story of Zionism, where it goes and how it exports itself. Yeah, you think about. I mean, I'm pretty sure too. The Saudis used Pegasus to spy on Khashoggi, and was like that played a key role. I could be confusing that, but pretty sure that happened too. But I'm not surprised. I mean, it's like it hardly like needs to be said at this point. But like the idea, like one of the things that like so like mind-boggling about Israel is that how it does the dirty work for like so many different countries, how it operates. And you have that quote yourself, right? Like the Menachem Begin quote. Actually, maybe we should go south a little bit into Central America, because we really see the flourishing of Israeli skill sets, so to speak, in there. I mean, like to talk about terror, and yeah, like it's they really do export terror. It's like one of their greatest exports.
Yeah, I mean, what happens, and it's interesting though, because in academia, at least like there's not a lot of stuff done by historians of Latin America on this topic recently. But in the 80s, there's a series of good books, Bahbah's book included, that really was tracking this stuff. There's really good articles by more like obviously non-mainstream media sources that were reporting like that Israel was arming these death squad regimes in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. To think about this like regionally in Central America, right? Generally speaking, what we have in Central America in the 70s, in most of these countries, is that you have a small oligarchic elite that's working in tandem with a military or a national guard, sometimes a national guard that was initially created and funded and trained by the United States, and who are trying to put down a very powerful, emergent, usually peaceful social movements. And with each instance of terror, state terror, these social movements will start to radicalize, and you have the emergence of really powerful guerrilla organizations in places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala in the 70s and 80s that are attempting to overthrow whether outright military dictatorships or some sort of hybrid like military dictatorship with a couple of oligarchs included to give it the facade of some sort of representative democracy. So these are countries that are facing really powerful, popularly backed revolutionary insurgencies. And initially, of course, they're going to turn to the U.S. A lot of their security forces, their intelligence were trained and at the School of the Americas, or Fort Benning, Georgia, whatever, an entire archipelago of different U.S. military installations. But by the time we get to the 1970s, especially during the Jimmy Carter presidency, because he was the so-called human rights president, there was a lot of pressure domestically in the U.S. and within Congress to not publicly and openly back some of these regimes. So the U.S. throughout the late 70s and even during the Reagan administration in the 80s, the U.S. government faced certain they were hamstrung essentially by Congress and by civil society groups from openly backing and financing and training some of these horrific regimes. Israel did not face the same challenges. So some of the things that we see in the 70s and 80s is that Israel is able to do kind of like the dirty work of the United States in the region. So when the U.S., especially under Reagan, is prevented from financing and training and arming the Contras, these horrific death squad regimes in Nicaragua, Israel can come in and do it. And Israeli politicians are very open about it, right? Like they're like, we will work with anybody minus the Soviet bloc, right? Like they said that was the only limit. They wouldn't work with leftist regimes. They would work with South Africa, and they would work with some of the more horrific regimes in Latin America. So I guess we can go like country by country, just to give an example. So Nicaragua, again, as I mentioned earlier, that there's three different. There was a Somoza elder that took power in the 1930s. He's the guy who FDR referred to once as he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And then eventually his two sons would rule Nicaragua in dictatorial fashion until the late 1970s. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this family had a long-standing relationship with Israel even before its official foundation as a state. By the time we get to the late 70s and you have this powerful guerrilla insurgency led by the Sandinistas, the FSLN, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, there was pitted against Somoza's National Guard or army that was originally organized and trained by the United States. When National Guard members assassinate on camera a U.S. journalist in 1978, the Carter administration is forced to cut off all aid to the Somoza regime, and in steps in Israel. And actually, Israel had already been arming the Somoza National Guard throughout the 1970s, but definitely after the cutoff of U.S. aid in 78, like all their weaponry was Israeli. And again, it was in the service of a oligarchic, horrific, repressive regime against a revolution that was broad-based, that was multi-class, that was politically heterodox. And eventually wins, and they take power in 1979. Now, the guys who lost that revolution, they didn't just go away. A lot of them went to Miami, or they went to Costa Rica, or they went to Honduras, and they started to fund these, what we now know as contras, right? These counter-revolutionary, essentially death squads that also ended up obtaining financing and weaponry from Israel. And this had to be super secret. This had to be clandestine because the U.S. government, because of certain congressional resolutions, were unable to fund the contras. And we've talked about that on our Iran-Contra episode, right? But these guys are really awful.
Wacky story of Iran-Contra never fails to amuse.
These guys were pretty awful. They were just, despite someone like Ana Navarro on CNN talking about how she's a proud daughter of a Contra, like they were death squads. They were horrible. And one of the things that they started to receive was weaponry, particularly Russian-made weaponry, that the Israelis had captured from the PLO when they invaded Lebanon in 1982. So they then started sending thousands of like AK-47s to the Contras so they could then use it to destabilize the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. One of the other interesting things I think is it's relevant now, right? Because of, folks are being attacked for criticizing Zionism as somehow being anti-Semitic. There was an effort by the Reagan administration and by conservative Jewish groups in the U.S. and in Nicaragua to smear the Sandinista government as being anti-Semitic because they were anti-Israel. And you have this interesting moment in 1984 when a fact-finding mission by a group called New Jewish Agenda from the U.S. went to Nicaragua, and they came back and they're like, nope, we found no evidence of anti-Semitism. And actually, you guys using the charge of anti-Semitism does a great disservice to actual struggles against anti-Semitism. So I think it's interesting to think about that, considering the current political climate social climate in the U.S. and in Europe, where those on our side are getting shut down and facing a lot of shit. El Salvador is a similar story. El Salvador, a horrific oligarchy with really advanced intelligence services and a military, start to face a series of big, broad-based social movements throughout the 1970s. There's also several different guerrilla groups out in the countryside operating, but as this regime starts to ramp up the terror against the population, including in the early 80s assassinating the archbishop of the country, Oscar Romero, these different guerrilla groups come together and form a coalition called the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí de Frente de Liberación Nacional. And in response, this Salvadorian hybrid military dictatorship starts to receive a lot of support and training from the Israelis. So just from like 75 to 79 alone, like 83% of their defense imports were from Israel. When U.S. Congress prevented Reagan in the early 80s from funding this death squad regime, Israel provided generous arms credits. They also sent about 100 military advisors to help the Salvadorian National Guard, police, and military put down a really powerful guerrilla group that, had it not been for this type of support, and the U.S. support, probably would have taken power in El Salvador. In 1984, the Air Force commander of El Salvador admitted that they bought napalm from Israel. So they used napalm as part of their counterinsurgency in the countryside against the FMLN. And just to give you a sense of like some of the Salvadorian military officers who worked with the Israelis, there's a quote, I think I cite it in this article. There's a guy by the name of he's a Colonel Sigifredo Ochoa Perez, who was like a key actor in the counterinsurgency against the FMLN. When they asked him if their planning was based on like U.S. experiences and knowledge, he said, quote, "They lost. The Americans know nothing. but the Taiwanese and the Israelis do know. And for him, he wanted to put down the FMLN in the way that the Israelis had put down the Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza. And he also wanted to go after Nicaragua because he viewed Nicaragua as kind of like the Lebanon of Central America. And he accused Nicaragua then under the Sandinista rule of providing support for the Salvadorian guerrillas. So it's really, again, it's like this interesting like geopolitical export from West Asia and input into Central America in the early 1980s. But the country that most directly was affected, the extent of influence by Israeli arms and counterinsurgency technology, training, etc., was Guatemala. And in Guatemala, you had a military dictatorship that from 1981 to 1983 waged what the UN categorized as a genocide. More than 150,000 Mayans were killed in a scorched earth counterinsurgency policy. More than 600 Mayan communities were disappeared from the face of the earth. And because of that, despite Ronald Reagan's efforts to present the Guatemalan military dictatorship as freedom fighters, as God-fearing freedom fighters, they were unable to support him to the extent that they wanted to. And once again, Israel is able to step in and provide some of the military logistics, support, knowledge, etc. So they did things like build air bases. They built they set up a computerized intelligence system where they could tap telephones, and that they had taken that directly from the occupied territories. And they used that to essentially wipe out the urban guerrilla movement in Guatemala because they were able to track the telephone calls from these different groups. A Time magazine article from 1983 said, quote, "Army outposts in the jungle have become near replicas of Israeli army field camps." They had a very close working relationship. Some of the Guatemalan military officers would talk about the Palestinianization of the Mayan communities. Like they wanted to do what the Israelis had done to the occupied territories in Gaza. They wanted to apply that to indigenous communities that they had identified as communist. And if they were communist, therefore they were worthy of extermination. And it wasn't just an attack on indigenous communities themselves, but it was a wholesale attack on indigenous culture. Indigenous cultural markers became a symbol of, they associated that with communism. So it was a very settler colonial project of trying to eradicate these different indigenous communities in Guatemala that like constituted more than 50% of the population. It was something like 60 to 70%, right? You had Guatemalan military officers telling Guatemalan military officers would tell U.S. journalists that their Israeli trainers told them to, quote, "treat the Indians like we treat the Palestinians. Do not trust any of them." So again, it's a very clear cut. And you had things like the establishments of Galil factories in Guatemala. I think the only other country that managed to achieve that was Colombia in the 80s and 90s. Right, so they had a very clear, close working relationship. And I think Guatemala is also one of the few countries that located their embassies in Jerusalem, I think, if I remember correctly, right? So it was a really tight relationship. And their 300 Israeli advisors helped them wage this really brutal counterinsurgency against the guerrilla movement that they managed to essentially wipe out by the late 80s. And then by 1996, you have a peace treaty that ends 30 years of civil war and conflict in Guatemala. So again, I know I've been like rambling on, but like you see a very clear exporting of settler colonial technologies and knowledges from West Asia to Central America in the service of putting down revolutionary movements that were, again, to emphasize, they were politically heterodox, right? Like, if anything, the people at the bottom who made up these revolutionary movements, they were more motivated by things like liberation theology than like Soviet or Cuban interpretations of Marxism. It was liberation theology. So like it was very clear like who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, right? And despite U.S. government efforts to kind of muddle the popular understandings of these conflicts, which is something like we see today, right? Which I feel like being online or reading U.S. media is like constant gaslighting, like what happened with the hospital that got bombed. So you see a really close working relationship, and for Israel, it was profitable, right? Again, like the arms industry was central to their economy, their heavily indebted economy, and it's still they to this day. Bahbah's book ends in like 1987, but if anything, he was kind of predicting the trajectory. And now I think last year for sure, haven't looked at statistics this year, but last year, or at least 2021, when I wrote this article, Israel per capita had the highest, was producing like the highest volume of weapons, and it was the arms industry occupied the biggest space within their broader economy.
Yeah, they call it high tech, but the tech itself is for military, because that's the most profitable part of tech. Like, that's where the profits are. And so, like, yeah, no, it's insane. No, the scale of all this is so mind-boggling to think of, like, Guatemala alone. And, you know, this continue. I mean, I was thinking recently, I was like, while you were talking, I was like, oh yeah, like there's also the like cultural component of like what they share. I mean, forget the like material, like military thing, but like think of like someone like Jair Bolsonaro and how he like identifies with Zionism, like how Zionism appeals to him personally, and how like the same sort of toxic brand that he rules over, and like that, and like you just see settler colonialism and its various spawns, and how Israel is at the center of them, providing arms to these like other settler colonial projects, because this also exposes like Latin America's sort of vague, sort of mixed role in the history of settler colonialism that like is still there, that it's just as office as like, but it's because I think it's as dumb as, because they're brown, people just like forget it, that like settler colonial, like, because like, you know what I mean, they just collapse European settler colonialism with white supremacy in the same way, and like they see brown people and they're like, oh yeah, that's different than here, but it's like, no, that's like the unfolding. And in fact, it's actually older. Settler colonialism is older in South America and Latin America than it is in up here, than in this part of the province, like actually a couple centuries older, right? And so like in a way that like Latin America also was, or South America too, it was also a training ground and a laboratory of settler colonialism that was exported in a very real way across their own European continent, those technologies. And so like you see these patterns interacting, and you just like your brain is like melting from the scale of it all.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far back you want to go, right? Because you can go back to like 1492 and the expelling of Jews from what ends up being Spain, and then the eventual expulsion of Moors, you know, Muslims from Spain, like a century later, right? And recreating an Iberian Peninsula that had 7-8 centuries of like different groups of Muslims and Muslim kingdoms, right? So it's, I mean, yeah, it just, and then that's going to get taken over. A lot of those technologies, ideas, and methodologies will be in the minds of the so-called conquistadors that will then go into places like the Caribbean, Mexico, and then South America, right? So it's a long ass story, right? And obviously there's changes over time, there's different things, right? But this is, this shit's been going on for more than 500 years. I mean, like this is the world we inhabit today is a product of what happened after 1492. The one thing I'll say about what you mentioned about Israel, the only thing though that allowed them to have this reach to a place like Central America or South America or South Africa was that all this was being subsidized to a certain extent by the US, right? So Bahbah has some really interesting parts in the book where the US sometimes would come down on Israeli arms transfers and say, no, you can't sell that because that's our technological proprietary information. So it's very, and now I think 2023, like 1/6 of Israel's military budget comes from the US, right? What, $3 to $4 billion a year. So it's, a lot of this is enabled by the financial and the diplomatic support that the US government was giving Israel in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's only expanded since then, right? I think we really are in need like of a broader book-based study that kind of takes off from like where Bahbah stopped in like 87, and to see that it's only gotten bigger and it's only gotten more technological and it's only gotten more sophisticated. And now we see it again. If you want to look at like borders around the world, the most sophisticated, the most expansive, the most coercive border technologies that you can find, whether it's here in Arizona and Mexico or in Kashmir, it's Israeli technology that they've gotten by proving it on the ground and researching it and applying it in places like the occupied territory in Gaza.
Yeah, we think human experiments. We think like some evil Nazi doctor doing like putting twins in baths or like vats of ice or something, or like, but no, this is like human experimentation on a scale of like millions of people, police experimentation that you then, and on top of that, Israel uses Gaza to test weapons that like they use, and like these unconventional weapons, like these, this is a showcase. I mean, this is so disgusting to say, but these countries use violence as a showcase to show off. I mean, that's what the Azerbaijanis do. They use it to show off, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think to the back. I was thinking back to the beginning of this Ukraine craziness 2 years ago, uh, and you think about like European towns raising money to buy Turkish drones. Like this is like we are our capitalist economy is so addicted to war, and we're instructed to be part of that addiction, that we have to supply the means by which other countries are destroyed. Like we ourselves are a role in it, play it. It's not just our taxes, but we have to actively buy or in other ways support, like emotionally. So we buy a lunch for a Ukrainian soldier. We buy vegan food for Israeli soldiers. Like this is a like the war industry has evolved in such a way.
Um, they have a crazy relationship too since the 80s, right? We know that like private military contractors from Israel helped train and finance and arm the Medellin cartel, the different death squads the anti-communist death squads that came out in the 80s and 90s. Carlos Castaño, who was the leader of one of the most infamous, bloodiest right-wing death squad groups, the AUC, like he talks about in his memoir that he received training in Israel and in Colombia from Israeli military advisors and trainers. There's a Galil and other the Galil rifle factory was set up in Colombia in the 80s or 90s, and now I think there's two or three more different types of Israeli assault rifle companies that set up in Colombia, to the point where like their military, their air force, and their national police all use different Israeli-made rifles. Like one likes the Galil, one likes the Tovar, one likes the Ace, they had a really close working relationship, both on a governmental level and also this really infra world of horrific death squad right wing death squad groups like the AUC, who also trafficked a massive amount of drugs into the United States, including cocaine. And Petro has disrupted that. Right, and I think that's a really interesting change. He's facing a variety of domestic challenges, right? But it was really interesting to see him challenge. He's really the first Latin American leader to challenge the Israeli government in terms of what they're doing in Gaza, and it was shocking to a lot of people because of that close relationship that Israel and Colombia had for a long time. But once this leftist wins the elections and becomes president, he's completely, well, not completely, he started to redefine the relationship to the point where he's saying that he's going to establish a Colombian embassy in Ramallah. That's huge. That's like a big moment. Obviously Venezuela and Cuba have had a long relationship with different Palestinian organizations, so they came out pretty quickly and criticizing and denouncing what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza. I haven't really followed, like, I know AMLO, they've tried to get AMLO to say stuff, and I don't recall him explicitly addressing the issue. Like, he's notoriously like not good at like international stuff. So other than like talking shit to the US.
Evo came out and said they should pull their ambassador, right?
Evo came out really strongly, and that's another different mess in Bolivia right now, because there's like a split within the MAS, right, between followers of Evo and the supporters of the current president, Luis Arce. So if Colombia is no longer Israel's main ally in the region, the one that's kind of taken its place is a country that is being turned into a dictatorship by a Palestinian descendant, and that's Bukele in El Salvador, which is nuts, right? So this guy Bukele, his parents or his grandparents were immigrants from Palestine. He's Palestinian, and he's been a pretty steadfast supporter of Israel throughout this, even before the current before the Al-Aqsa flood operation and everything that's happened since then. So it's a really weird dynamic, because there's a really interesting history and story of like the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of West Asian immigrants that came to Latin America after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right? And they went to places like Chile, they went to places like Argentina, they went to Central America, they went to Colombia, in Mexico, right? The world's, I don't know, second wealthiest man, Carlos Slim, is like Middle Eastern descendant. And then you have this guy in El Salvador who's a descendant of Palestinian migrants, who is he's trying to turn El Salvador into into a dictatorship. And he's also, I think, that has that Christian Zionist bent to his support for the country. And, one of the biggest religious trends in the region in the last 20, 30 years has been the increasing number of evangelical Christians, conversions to evangelical Christians. And that's one of the things that explains that nutbag Bolsonaro, right? His relationship to Israel is really because of this evangelical Christian Zionism that fueled a lot of his base. So at protests and rallies in support of Bolsonaro, you would see a lot of Israeli flags, which was really interesting, right? Yeah, people have made this point. Like, it's not an original point, but like, there's more Zionists like outside of Israel than inside of Israel, right? Yeah. There might be more in the United States, and these are these Christian.
Yeah, non-Jews. Yeah. There's far more non-Jewish Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists.
So that's an interesting, the religious component in Latin America, especially with like larger numbers, growing communities of evangelical Christians, some of whom will start to adopt and articulate that form of Christian Zionism. But it's a fractured region now, right? Like, I think the fact that Israel can no longer count on Colombia as like this long-time steadfast ally, the fact that Bolsonaro is out of power in Brazil is a big deal. And obviously can't count on Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba. Mexico's a more complicated situation, especially with the Pegasus stuff. But that I think this is a point though that I really want to make, and I made it on this streaming thing that I did last week with Revolutionary Black Network, I think is what they're called, is that regardless of what these governments are doing in Latin America, the streets are with Palestine, man. And we see this all over the world. We see it in the United States. It's very clear to folks, everyday folks, people on the street, like what is going on, what are the parameters of this conflict, what side we should be on. It's very clear to them, regardless of what their government's position vis-a-vis Israel is.
Yeah, it's true. This is the position we're at. Most of the world is on Palestine's side, actually, but that we have, unfortunately, we're ruled by a class of people who, I was thinking about the title of the Public Enemy album. It takes a nation of millions to hold us back, and how like it takes like country, it takes countries of the world, like numbering in terms of their population, like billions, to like keep Palestinians down, to like, because they supply Israel with all their credibility. Like you could choke Israel off through just like a good BDS campaign. I believe that. Like I do believe that. Like if you really did, if they did it at the statewide level, like if Turkey refused to send food, or if like if or like oil transfers that happen, it's there are ways to starve this genocidal machine. But unfortunately, the countries who, like the people who are in charge of countries around the world, like they don't really care. Most countries, at least. There's a few that do care, and and it hurts their interests. If anything, it gets their countries destroyed. If anything, and they're the ones that support it. But yeah, most don't, and it's hard to push for that. So part of like our project here on these podcasts, I guess, help build the kind of support. So this is always good. It's always good to learn more about the endless mind fuckery, like blown, like the fuckery of the Zionists and their ways all around the world.
You totally dated us. You totally dated us with that reference, man. With the Public Enemy reference. Like we're so
Alex,
old.
what do you have cooking so far? What do you got cooking in the pot?
Can I make a quick point about to respond what you just said,
Yeah,
right?
of
At
course,
the
of course,
at the
of
state
course.
level, something like BDS at a state level would be really powerful, right? So to bring back Colombia. Colombia had this massive social uprising in 2019, and the police and the military that were shooting people and that were torturing people, imprisoning people, they were all outfitted with Israeli rifles, and they were using Israeli personnel carriers to put down this massive social protest, right? So
Looking forward to that, Alex. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I know you're traveling soon. You got to go get prepped for that.
thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thank you, as always, for letting me talk shit and rant, and for the dated references that help me feel better about us getting old, man.
No,
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.